Good morning, and thank you for joining State of the Union Q3 Recap and Holiday Outlook, Segment Revival and Retail Resilience with RJ Hotovoy, Head of Analytical Research at Placer AI. As a reminder, if you have any questions during the conversation, to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Now here's your host, Deborah Weinswig, CEO and founder of Coresight Research.
Thanks, Mara. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today to really dive into it. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. Many of us are fresh off of Grocery Shop, where retail media was discussed at length. Also, we want to get an update from RJ on, kind of what are we seeing early in the holiday season? Everything's kind of being pulled forward these days. Anything to note from Halloween? And then also what we're seeing in terms of shift, not only by channels, but also geography, the state of the consumer, and much more. So RJ, thanks for joining us, and maybe just kind of kick us off with reminding everybody kind of what Placer is, how you guys kind of, aggregate your data and insights, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah. And that was a great introduction, because I do think there's a lot of interesting trends intersecting at this point. So just for a brief introduction for those who aren't familiar with Placer, we are a location-based analytics company powered by mobile data. In simpler terms, that means that we come up with foot traffic estimates for any physical property in the US, whether that's an individual store, a retail chain, a restaurant, a convention center, a downtown area, anything you can draw a shape on a map, we can come up with traffic estimates for. How do we get that traffic estimates? Well, we partner with several dozen app companies and put a little bit of code into those apps. And from that, we get 24/7 anonymized aggregated data regarding location of that device, but importantly, no personal information about that device user. From that sample, from those partnerships, we've been able to build a panel of 25 million devices that we track, which represents a little under 10% of the US population. But that's where the AI and Placer AI comes in. From there, that sample that we see going into the different locations, we're able to extrapolate that using a number of variables to come up with estimates. At this point, we work with almost half of the top 25 retailers in the US, and they've tested our data against their own people counters and other things. And generally speaking, we have a pretty high correlation with that data. But more importantly, we're much more than just a foot traffic company at this point. We partner with a lot of other data sets and have other ways to view the data. Things like visitor journey, where are people shopping, besides that retail location? Where did they come from before? Where do they go after? How long do they spend in stores? Visit frequency, are certain initiatives working, or certain things not? One of the things we do is partner with other data sets like census data or pop stats, where we can come up with estimates for that person coming in without infringing any personal information. So I think, we're much more than just a foot traffic analytics company. There's a lot of different ways we can help make decisions regarding real estate, marketing, and strategy. So quick introduction on Placer, and Deborah, I'll turn it back over to you here.
As we start to kind of think about some of these shifts by channel and by region, and look at this from like a time perspective, how does this kind of compare? I mean, we're seeing weakness, obviously, during the back to school period. What does that tell you? And is it kind of in line with what you would have expected? There was a lot of hype going into back to school. So how does kind of, as we look at July and August of this year, how does that compare to what you would have expected?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and really there's two things going on, I think, that kind of led to the softness in August. One, we've been hearing it from retailer after retailer, the idea that necessity goods are costing more. And even as inflation started to moderate, I think, even food is still more expensive than we were a couple of years ago. Rent, healthcare, all these different necessity costs have gone up, which has taken a lot out of discretionary spending. And I think it just caught up with a lot of the retailers, at least on the second half of back to school. Early back to school was okay. The second half, I think we started to see that. The other is, it's really been a very event and holiday driven consumer this year. If you go back to the major holidays, so Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Easter, we saw a lot of visitation trends during those periods, but it's the shoulder periods in between that we've seen a lot of weakness. And I think we're kind of in that melees coming out of back to school with nothing really to drive a lot of consumer interest right now. I think back to, what are major product trends, and, outside of maybe iPhone 15, there really isn't anything you kind of say that's getting consumers excited right now. Now, when we look to kind of the Halloween period, which is becoming a bigger part of the holiday calendar, if you will, that's starting to account for a lot more visits than than it has pre-pandemic. So it'll be interesting to see when we get to that period. But it's kind of in that holding period right now, I think, for a lot of consumers, by extension, the retailers they shop.
And there is this idea, of course, that holiday gets kind of earlier and earlier every year. I think the most recent data I saw, kind of 1/3 of consumers have already completed their holiday shopping. But kind of completed for others versus completed for yourself, right? That definition may be a bit murky, but it is this idea too, right? Kind of this entire fourth calendar quarter is now kind of defined as holiday. How do you see retailers preparing differently for that? And I do think as a result, as you just mentioned, right, Halloween then moves earlier to make room for holiday, right? Because we don't want the two of them competing at the same time. How do you kind of think about all that, and what does that mean for store traffic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And by the way, too, I want to meet these shoppers that already have their holiday shopping done, because that is very impressive. That is certainly not me. It is interesting because there is a waterfall effect when we start to see the holiday period push earlier and earlier. And I think Prime Day, the second Prime Day coming in early October, it only exacerbates it. This is the point that requires you to have holiday inventory or Halloween inventory already in stores as early as early August. I think we started to see that, very early this year. It kind of has a ripple effect on a lot of things here. So I do think that you kind of have to adjust your expectations in terms of that. Maybe the, October, could start very well with, kind of the pull forward in demand. It may look good on a year-over-year basis, but that may lead to some softness in November, at least right till we get to usually Black Friday still. It doesn't have the same cachet that it once did, but I think it's still an important holiday. It's still one of the top 5, retail visitation days on the calendar year. So I think that you just kind of have to manage your expectations. And to your point, think about it for the totality of the fourth quarter. You may have some swings and different things, but kind of have to factor it in. And one thing will be interesting this year too. If you think back to November, it was kind of a soft period last year, kind of that was starting to see the interest rates start to kick in, things like that. That could be a period where we have some easier comparison, might lead some a little bit better than expected numbers when we look at the visitation trends for November. But it'll be interesting to see where we stand as we kind of move through the fourth quarter here.
Well, and RJ, we were chatting before the call. I think there's also just been, if we think about two of the major impacts to the consumer, right? One was between February and March, depending on what state you live in, kind of the rolling back of the SNAP benefits.
Yep.
And then right now it's more been the noise around, kind of the sunsetting of what many thought were, some of this kind of, let's just say, this elimination of some of the student loan repayments. And I think it's still, I'm sure you're reading this every day. It gets more confusing by the day for the consumer.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's, the SNAP benefits, I think, we've seen the impact of that pretty quickly, right? That's something, right? Average consumer going to the grocery store 2.1 times per week. We saw that, as early as April and May. And that, I think, with this continued inflation, albeit at a moderating pace, but still inflation, and going back to what you said, right? Consumers remember what they paid 2 and 3 years ago for things, and it's definitely higher. There's a lot that they're dealing with right now. As you look ahead, how do you think that impacts, new stores and, everything else?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the great things about having a tool like Placer is to be able to track trends in real time, and it's been fascinating to look at, particularly on the value channel. Obviously, they're facing their own inflation on a lot of their input costs and stuff, and even raising prices for somebody like that, like a dollar store raising prices moderately, you do see almost an immediate pushback from consumers right now, particularly that lower to middle income consumer. We're seeing a lot of pushback on price increases. So I think price sensitivity, you're exactly right. And it's kind of been one wave after another. I think if you go even back to last March is when really the kind of first point where I think that psychological trigger happened for a lot of consumers. They'd been dealing with food inflation for a while, but that was the week we got the big spike in gas prices. And it's pretty much continued since then. There's been one inflationary factor that's been weighing down, whether again, rent, healthcare, SNAP, and student loan repayments. That's an interesting one too. It's a good question to bring up because honestly, I don't think we've seen much of an impact at this point. I think that one may take a little bit more time. That first payment that consumers make, maybe they had enough to cover that, but it's that second and third that may take out some of the discretionary spending power, with certain demographic groups. So that'll be interesting to watch over the next couple of months. Again, I don't think we've seen much of an impact. I think a lot of the weakness we're seeing right now, again, is kind of, like I said, the lack of an event and kind of the other necessity inflation that's weighing on discretionary spend. But it'll be interesting to see because there are some headwinds in terms of the next couple of months as well.
Yeah, and I think as we look at the next slide, right? I mean, as we think about kind of, the different industries, it's quite interesting. I mean, we've seen definitely in the data that we kind of track, real changes around kind of eating out and travel, right? The highly discretionary categories.
Yeah.
And so it does seem like there's almost this, kind of return. It's interesting. We've heard this in two different ways from executives last week. One was this idea around like the return to traditionalism, which was an interesting kind of idea.
Yeah.
And then I also heard, which was kind of like the same idea, was people were thinking about how they kind of like live their lives pre-pandemic and moving back to what they did then. So it's really kind of this, almost, anytime consumers go through a challenging event, this idea of kind of, moving to a place of comfort. And, it's interesting because we'd seen a lot of, I would say, we'd seen a lot of differences kind of month by month over spending on the home, which once again, I thought everybody was all full up right during 2020, but it says something to me that we are seeing this spending, kind of not necessarily on furniture, but more on like soft home and home decor.
Yep.
That is really interesting. And, kind of as we look at, kind of some of these industries, I think that, if you can give us context, right? I mean, people are obviously looking for a deal. People are taking care, right? A car wash, you're taking care of the assets you have.
Yeah.
And fitness too, right? Your asset is yourself. So, I mean, it's really quite interesting. So I love your take, RJ.
You bring up one of our favorite water cooler discussions around the Placer Research team is which categories that we're seeing are just kind of returning to normal, that maybe got a pull forward in demand because of the pandemic. And now we're seeing softness because that demand got pulled forward and we're seeing a normalization, and which ones we've seen real structural change in. And that's the biggest question, I think, for a lot of retail investors right now, is understanding which ones where consumer behavior has changed, which one we're just seeing a return to normalcy. You hit a lot of good topics on that, just with that introduction here. Home furnishing has been super interesting because, in fact, it's probably one of the categories we've gotten most questions on from both investors as well as the companies we work with, the retailers we work with, just because we are seeing a bit of a dichotomy where, to your point, furniture has been weak. So the companies that are primarily furniture are a bit weak, where that was largely a pull forward. We saw the pull forward in demand as people wanted to improve their home, to your point, improve the asset. But that demand, I think, has largely been met. We've seen, second home, kind of that phased out a little bit too. So there has not been as much demand for furniture, but, housewares and soft goods, we have seen a bit of improvement this year. And if we go back and look at the weekly trends, I think it traces back to that event driven, purport. We've seen, the fine dining category. We've seen certain gift retailers and certain housewares. I think a lot of people are doing home entertaining during these holiday periods. And so I think that's driving a lot of that demand. I do think if we look overall, and to be honest, there's been some benefit from Bed Bath & Beyond leaving the market as well. I think we've seen some retailers benefit from that trend as well. But I largely think we're seeing this event-driven consumer focus. So I think that's what's driving a lot of it. To your point on fitness and car wash, been very interesting to look at, because I think if you go and look at categories that have changed structurally, fitness is one of those. It was like clockwork every year, looking back, in the early 2000s in the fitness category. You see this big ramp up in the first quarter and then see attrition all the way through the fourth quarter in terms of that, membership churn, and then the cycle would repeat itself. What was interesting coming out of the pandemic, and this was a little bit started, is some of the value priced fitness offerings like Planet Fitness, Shoes, Blink Fitness, that $10 entry price point really changed kind of the normal attrition curve that we see throughout the year. So, and it also allowed a lot of younger consumers to have that membership. So we do see attrition throughout the year, but that's a lot less steep than what we saw. A lot higher visit frequency. I think we're seeing like 5 or 6 visits per month versus, previously pre-pandemic 4 to 5. So that to us is there's a real structural change within the fitness category. Car wash is a little bit the same too. And I think a lot lot of it just has, we're seeing, in terms of new asset or new light vehicle sales and whatnot, a lot more care and upgrades needed. We see with home or the auto repair retailers as well. So I think you're spot on with kind of improving the asset, whether it's your home, your body, or your car. Seeing a lot of that driving motivation in consumer spending right now.
You also wonder, RJ, with the number of people who are still working in a hybrid environment, right? The ability to, kind of, whether it's take care of yourself, take care of your car, take care of your home, outside of the kind of, let's just say it used to be before 8 a.m. and after 5 p.m. But now that that's a bit more fluid, if you will, I wonder if some of these trends have a longer lifespan than we would have expected.
Yeah, I think, yeah, go ahead.
And, this idea that, there's also, I would say, a desire to think differently about how one is spending kind of their day, right? Everyone wants to get everything done. But in some cases, right, it's kind of more the norm that, you can do it, whether it's at 5 a.m. if that's good for you, or 10 p.m. But there's a lot of, I think, what had been kind of expected. And, I think employers are, increasingly, if they don't want to see turnover, are increasingly, comfortable, right, and trusting their employees to get their work done in a very different way.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth to that too. And it's been interesting to kind of look at some of the behaviors that, initially were thought of that's just happening because of the pandemic that have actually had legs. And one of the ones I look at is kind of with coffee. When the pandemic hit, that morning commute, we stopped commuting. That early morning day part of Starbucks and Dunkin' and Dutch Bros, saw a big decline. But that late morning, after you drop your kids off, picking up coffee then, or even the early afternoon, just to get out of the house and keep your sanity, we saw a big improvement in that. And I think a lot of people expected that to reverse. If you look at return to office right now, our data suggests that we're about, give or take 65% recovered in terms of the number of visits to office buildings. It's a higher number of visitors, which reflects that hybrid environment. Effectively, not many people coming back on Monday, Friday, and everybody's coming back Tuesday through Thursday. But that's still been pretty steady. It hasn't, only gone up five points year over year in terms of return to office. So I think that a lot of these behaviors, because of that hybrid environment, have to be factored in. And, it not only impacts kind of, your hours of operation, your inventory management for a lot of retailers, it dictates how you're going to construct stores. Do you need the same size store that you once had in an urban environment or by an office area? A lot of factors really hinge on that too. And it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
And as you look ahead, and think about kind of traffic, not only this year, but into 24, what are some of if you were to kind of just throw out some of your predictions, what do you think is going to be different, next year versus what we've seen in 23?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think that looking ahead to next year, it's kind of like, when are we going to finally have that normal year? I mean, we had a pandemic year, and then, the 21 was the year of adjustment where everybody was kind of learning a new consumer behavior. And then 22 is going to be that year where we're going to make all these changes based on the behavior, but then inflation hits. And now we have to adjust our, understanding consumer behavior again. And now 23 is kind of not only inflation, but just overall kind of discretionary
interest rates. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Interest rates, and when are we going to get that normal year back? And
24, it's 24.
It's next year. I swear it's coming. I think is going to be interesting to see. To me, there's going to be a lot of continuation of the trends we're seeing. I don't think there's any reason to expect a major change, either both positive or negative. I think that, at this point, we've been 9-10 months into kind of the rising interest rate environment. And so we've seen consumers adjust there. Again, we'd mentioned that student loan payments could be a headwind, but, that's probably not affecting, the broader population. That's probably, 15-20% of the population that would see some impact, probably less than that, to be honest, that would see some impact from, resuming student loan payments. So I think we're going to have this continuation next year, kind of this more event driven, consumers are spending, they will spend, showing a willingness to spend, but for things that matter and the necessities. So events and holidays and things like that. In between, it could be continuing to be soft. I think we'll continue to see a focus on value, but not just low prices, but things that are innovative at the value channel. We'll be interested to see the one wrinkle to this too, and we've been kind of looking at, I mean, some of the categories that have been a little bit weak, like, consumer electronics, sporting goods that, benefited from a pull forward demand. Is there going to be a replacement cycle? This is something that we might start to see in 24 with certain categories that, we're going to be 5 years, almost 5 years past the pandemic, 4 or 5 years past the pandemic. Certain categories are going to see a replenishment cycle start to kick in, if that could start to bring people back to stores. But that's kind of what I'm thinking about for 24, at least initially.
That makes sense. And I think the next slide around kind of regional, what are we seeing in terms of migration, right? That had been such a huge topic over the past few years and had certainly had an impact on, where retailers are opening stores, where they're closing stores. Obviously, we have, organized retail crime impacting that as well. But if you can help us kind of think through just regionality, what's happening, that would be great.
Yeah. What's been interesting, I mean, I think the idea that people migrated from kind of northern, Chicago, New York, and San Francisco, and moved to Dallas, Phoenix, Tampa, the Carolinas, Houston, Austin. I think that's been pretty well documented, and that's exactly what we saw in our migration data. If we look year over 4 year, I think that's been pretty well documented, and that's exactly why you're starting to see groups like McDonald's, even who hasn't really opened up a ton of new stores the last decade, start to say, hey, we're going to start opening new stores, and it's because of this migration. But what's been the more interesting trend that probably is flown a little bit more on the radar is this idea that urban residential is starting coming back. So if we look on a year over 4 year basis, it's all the southern markets that are dominating our kind of our migration trend. If we look at kind of the year over year basis, it's been interesting because it is a lot of the New York, Chicago, even San Francisco shows up on that list, Washington, D.C., all these. And what we're thinking, based on our data, what seems to be happening is that a lot of the housing that wasn't accessible for kind of that Gen Z and millennial household now all of a sudden is within reach. It's certainly not cheap, but it's certainly accessible because there is some availability. So we're starting to see urban residential become a bit more of a trend, and maybe not something that's got as much publicity as it should have. So we're starting to see trends, particularly in the Northeast and some of the California markets as well as Chicago, we're starting to see that urban residential. So I think when you're kind of looking at, office and kind of return to office, I think it sometimes gets grouped in with urban residential. I think it's kind of separated too in terms of where we're going to start to see store openings and how retailers are thinking about real estate plans, because now all of a sudden you're getting markets where urban residential becomes very attractive and see some really strong visitation and by extension unit economics on those. Whereas, office is still a bit more of a mixed bag. So I think that's going to be the interesting thing to watch too. The other trend here too, and something we've been watching a lot, is this idea that, a lot of retailers are starting to embrace smaller markets. I mean, I think the old adage is that most national retailers usually stayed away from markets kind of under 150,000, unless there was a very specific strategic reason to do so. Maybe it's a college town, maybe it was certain demographics in that. But all of a sudden, we're seeing a lot of retailers, whether it be Planet Fitness, Kohl's, Petco, Lowe's, Chipotle, all go after these smaller markets, all the way down to something like 50,000. And a lot of that mirrors the migration patterns that we've seen, this idea that we've seen this big movement away from urban areas, and suburban and rural has definitely seen a lot more growth. But I think you kind of still have to kind of go case by case and market by market when looking at site selection and real estate plans, because it's a little bit different. And again, I don't think you can completely abandon urban strategies, especially with urban residential coming back in a lot of these markets.
What are you seeing in terms of, and that may take us into the next slide as well, what are you seeing in terms of mixed use and, kind of some of the changes in terms of how the consumer is, what is their purpose, if you will, in terms of visiting the mall, right? If that's obviously where they live, work, play, if that's where their family live, works, and plays, how are you seeing kind of, this kind of continued evolution of mixed use having an impact? And then also, what's the, kind of impact on the overall mall traffic as well?
Yeah, it's been interesting because I think we're starting to see the real impact of a mixed-use strategy. I think this has been one of the key themes in retail real estate this year, is the idea that a lot of the big retail REITs decided to embrace a mixed-use strategy coming out of the pandemic. Obviously, that takes time. That's not something that you can just adjust on the fly. You have to get the right tenants. A lot of times there's construction projects aligned with that. A lot of times there's just even marketing, as opposed to letting the retailers themselves market. You have to market the mall itself as a brand in a lot of cases. But I think this year, if we look kind of, the comparison between open air, indoor, and outlet malls, it's been super interesting to us to take a look and see that, I think most of the mixed use, and not most, but it was weighted heavily towards the open air centers, the mixed use transformations. And so we're starting to see that overtake kind of the other categories and see some of the benefits of the idea that bringing in residential, bringing in office, bringing in other kind of more experiential aspects to it is really having a positive impact. We've done some work with a couple of our retail real estate customers in terms of, they've done community engagement programs with concerts and other events. And what does that do to overall frequency, trade area size? And generally speaking, they have a positive impact. We've also looked at things like loyalty programs for a lot of the mall operators and stuff like that. And generally speaking, it's early, but it does seem like there is a positive effect when you have that as well. So I think that the companies that, again, a lot of the open air operators are doing some very interesting things to drive traffic right now. And I think it's showing up in the numbers here. Interesting on this one too. Outlet's been an interesting one too. Just kind of looking at that, that's actually been a little bit weaker. Trail a lot of it just for the early year, just because I think there was a lack of inventory availability in a lot of cases for a lot of the outlet guys. But we're also seeing some strategies there. Maybe not have an outlet as far away in some of these locations, but bringing outlets kind of more close to consumers and kind of more suburban areas, things like that. Obviously still trailing it, but that's been one of the interesting real estate trends is to watch some of the brands start to bring the outlets a little bit closer into more traditional retail settings.
It's interesting too. I mean, I've always thought, and it's fascinating to kind of see it in light purple and dark purple. But this idea around kind of back to school being much more of kind of a open air event, if you will. And it's always interesting to kind of see that written down. One question I have is going back to your comments around time of day for coffee and other, whether it's fitness or getting your car washed. Is we had seen some mall operators shrink their hours because, right, they were starting to see kind of the busiest hours 2 to 5, 1 to 4, right? It's like people go and grab a bite to eat and then they'd go shopping, right, in this kind of hybrid world. What are you seeing from that perspective?
Yeah, we've seen a bit of that too, that afternoon day part. We've definitely seen trends shift away from that morning day part, especially fitness side. We've definitely seen a shift more to the late afternoon. We've seen certainly some shopping trends on that too. So I think that's pretty consistent with our data as well. When we look at kind of broadly speaking, we've seen a shift to, early afternoon has kind of become kind of one of the key times for a lot of people. And again, to your point, if you're getting your work done, maybe you can take a couple hours off in the afternoon and, make that up at night. We are seeing, evidence of that. And I think part of that too is just being in different locations where maybe it is easier to go find, something, go to the mall, make a mall trip in the early afternoon, as opposed to waiting when you get home from work. Just having that flexibility, we are seeing trends in that behavior too. Certainly less early morning, which has been interesting to look at. I think partially that's some of the changes in commutes. A lot of people used to just incorporate that fitness trip into their morning commute, and obviously still, not only 65% recovered in terms of the number of visits. That changes the dynamics, but also the way some of the fitness clubs operate as well. So that's another one where I think, just broadly speaking, we have seen a shift in when the actual visits happen. Kind of afternoon becoming a key day part as opposed to kind of the evening. It's interesting too, because I think if you look on the weekend trends, that's largely held intact. Haven't seen a ton of variation there, maybe a little bit more on the evening, just with some of the entertainment type options that are there, but it hasn't been meaningful. It's just been interesting. And again, it's case by case too, and it kind of depends on the strategy by mall operator as well.
Well, I think the next slide is going to kind of talk a little bit about some of what we've seen from a weather event. And if I were to think about the 23, and then I think going into 24, right, because we're seeing much, I don't even want to call it exaggerated, certainly notable weather events that, in New York, we were, everyone was talking about, right? It's like it rained for like 4 days solid. And, just things that you don't, I will tell you, and I actually even remember who I was on the phone with in February of this year. I was out in shorts in New York, and I was like, that was like, for me, like the defining moment around really thinking differently about climate, right? Everyone's got and if it hasn't happened to you, it like, you will have that moment. But I think that, in light of that, I've always felt that, certainly looking in other geographies, outside the US, and how consumers think about kind of like an enclosed mall, right? On a really hot day, or, you're going to go and have like breakfast, lunch, and dinner because you don't want to be outside, those kinds of things. You don't have air conditioning. How are you seeing kind of the impact of the weather or climate? And what is that doing in terms of, going back to, we talked about open air, but how does that also kind of benefit enclosed? How do you think about that? I know it's like 20 questions, but
Yeah, that's,
your best.
it's been fascinating to look at just the weather trends, because that was a very popular topic among not only investors but also some of our retailer partners. And generally speaking, when we isolated it to the markets that had the highest temperature variations during that period, there was an impact. We did see less visits overall. I think indoor certainly benefited more than outdoor on that. What was fascinating to us, and we broke it down by restaurant category as well. We did actually see, in some cases, improvement for the full service dinings and casual diners, the ones that people are just looking for air conditioning there, whereas QSR suffered a little bit more, except for the ones that have established beverage platforms. So like the Taco Bells, the Sonics of the world, some of those benefited during that period as well. So I think certainly we've seen the weather impact, and certainly to your point, I don't know if it's going away. I think we're going to probably see continued evidence of these things, bigger swings because of weather. And again, I think that just basically you kind of have to have the right mix to kind of adjust for all this. So in cases of open air, that still means having some enclosed spaces for entertainment for other purposes, not necessarily movie theaters, but maybe it's an entertainment concept or something like that, for people to escape the heat. So I think that just kind of keep in mind that weather events are probably not going away anytime soon, and being able to adjust to that. So I think that's kind of what I've seen is that again, a lot of the operators are starting to realize that they need to have a good mix, not only from a mixed use and consumer behavior standpoint, but also a weather standpoint.
And are you seeing anyone kind of think differently about their physical construct, and as they make their plans going forward as a result of this?
Yeah, not necessarily weather, but I think it's a factor within the overall discussion. I mean, I think what we're seeing, generally speaking, is most retailers are at least moving a little bit more downsize in terms of store footprint, particularly the ones with kind of bigger ticket, bulkier items. I think we're seeing that shift. That's definitely been a trend in home furnishing, but that incorporates a lot of other factors. That's freed up a lot of space. We are seeing a ton of demand for dining and entertainment among malls. Again, kind of this idea of kind of live, work, play. That play aspect is certainly big, and I think there's a ton of demand for kind of this entertainment aspect to it. I think we're going to cover it in a later slide, but just kind of to front run a little bit here, there is a lot of demand for restaurants at malls right now. So I think that's factored in. I think they're just new tenants that maybe you hadn't thought of before, just creatively thinking outside the box in terms of that. So it is interesting to kind of see, but whether I think it's part of the overall discussion, and being able to kind of have something for everybody in no matter what the climate event might be. I think we've had a few conversations with mall owner operators on that front.
Yeah, I think that leads into the next slide where we're talking about kind of outliers, which is always quite interesting. I mean, it really is interesting to see kind of some of this data. I mean, what's your kind of key takeaway from this slide?
Yeah, from this slide is this, the impact that restaurants can have. I mean, it's an interesting time because if you look on a year-over-year basis, almost all categories for restaurant, with the exception of coffee, are down right now. Some of that reflects the closures during the pandemic. There's just less, availability, less supply of restaurants. Some of that reflects just the discretionary spending that we discussed earlier, and the fact that people are being more conservative in between holiday and event periods. But at the same time, too, if you take another layer deep and look at kind of the migration, what we're seeing in areas of migration, you see a lot of demand and a lot more, those outperform those markets where we see not only migration, but migration of higher household income consumers are definitely seeing outperformance in terms of restaurant, trends and stuff like that. And so these are some Westfield malls that have increased the exposure of restaurants and just kind of the visitation trends. Obviously, these are quite a bit above where we were, on that previous slide in terms of just the mall traffic that we saw. So they can have a positive impact, and it can draw in, a much wider trade area. We typically see a trade area expansion when we see a new dining option put in. We typically see, it depends on who you're targeting. It definitely changes the consumer base on that one too, the demographics. When you have that expanded trade area, it pulls in different demographics. And if you're trying to target a certain audience, whether it be younger audience, older audience, more affluent, less affluent, there are dining options. What's been interesting here too, this I think has kind of been one of the more interesting trends looking at the dining category. When the pandemic hit, and obviously the full service space was hit harder than quick service, what we saw right away, was a smaller pie, but it was the kind of the incumbents taking most of the share. It was the Darden's, the Cheesecake Factories, Brinker. Those are the companies that were taking the most share. Their brands were taking the most share. But we've seen a bit of a reversal on that the last year, maybe a year and a half. And now it's starting to be the independents, the smaller chains that are starting to gain share. And so I think that's the other message too, is that consumers are not only looking for new dining options, but they're looking for something that maybe they haven't seen before, or with an entertainment aspect. Kura Sushi has been a good example of this. Gen Korean, some of the more entertainment names out there. And again, on a year-over-year basis, it doesn't look as great. But if you look at visits per location now versus pre-pandemic, most of them are up pretty sizable. And then we've seen the gap between kind of the entertainment chains versus casual dining widen quite a bit. So there is a lot of evidence supporting that their consumers are looking for new concepts and new ideas that's having a benefit for overall mall traffic.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're hearing the idea more and more on hyper-local.
Yep.
And so I think that that's very much extending into, dining and kind of grocery as well. One thing I wanted to ask around this, especially since Westfield is where the data has been pulled, right? They've been very sophisticated as it relates to RMNs or retail media networks.
Yep.
You kind of, help us understand, kind of how important dining is to that. And as we lead into the next slide around retail.
Yeah, it's a perfect segue into retail media. And anybody who was at grocery shop, obviously, I mean, you couldn't get 5 minutes of the conversation on retail media. So I think it's here to stay. And I think it really is kind of a bit of a Wild West, a new frontier in terms of retail media. There's some established players that, have been doing this for a while, kind of the Walmarts, the Albertsons. Those are just some of the names that initially come to mind. But if you looked around the logos, at grocery shop, in terms of retail media, there's a lot of other chains starting to get into it. And to your point, it's not just the chains, it's the mall owner operators in a lot of cases too, realizing there's a lot of potential, with a lot of the initiatives they're doing in terms of, whether it be engagement, being able to communicate with their consumers. There's an opportunity for other brands to be part of that now in terms of retail media. Physical assets, obviously a big part of that too. There's a lot of physical space that can be utilized for retail media within the malls, and even just kind of, even retail partnerships too, partners with their tenants and whatnot. We're hearing a lot of that too. There's some stuff I can't give away because Westfield we're working on some projects with, but kind of that we're seeing across the board just renewed interest. And I think right now a lot of people are realizing, hey, there's a lot of potential in retail media, but how do we do it? And so that question has been difficult for a lot of people to answer right now. Is they want to get into it. They know there's an opportunity to do it. Maybe you've gotten some traction in digital, but making that shift from digital to physical is easier said than done, because it really takes a fundamental understanding of not only the transactions that happen at your locations, but also the visits in a lot of cases too. And so that's where we've helped out a lot of partners too, is better understanding who's coming in at different times of the day, because that we've already discussed it several times that changes in coffee shopper, that late afternoon, mall shopper now, it changes by the hour who's coming in, at any retail location. And so to better entice your potential partners, your retail media partners, the ones who are going to be advertising with you, you really have to demonstrate that complete understanding of that customer coming in. And I think that's still a lot of people are still trying to get their hands on all the variables that go into to make an effective pitch. The retail media partner pitches here as well. But it is interesting to see it's not just the retailers, it's the mall owner operators themselves getting into this business as well. And really anybody kind of involved with the overall retail ecosystem is probably participating in this this situation overall. And what we're showing here is just kind of the differences versus in luxury versus discount. Some of the things that we're seeing in this space too. There's even opportunities in this. I mean, a lot of people have been talking about the retail media opportunity in grocery and superstores, and I think that's obviously the largest opportunity. But there's tons of opportunities even in these categories as well.
I think that actually takes us to the next slide, though, because what we're hearing more and more is online and offline as it relates to RMNs. And that to me is, kind of ultimately where the power is, right? I mean, there are many who are vying to be able to measure, right, the offline and to tie that into kind of online. And so, data we're hearing, and I think it actually speaks to the strength of physical retail visits, is that, there is a 70% kind of movement from, right, you discover it online, you transact offline, and that seems to be getting, maybe it goes back to this whole idea around like traditionalism, but we are seeing this idea, and people are doing more and more research, right? And they're reaching out through other channels, right? It's not just the traditional channel, so that when they show up in a physical setting, right, they are incredibly informed, which in some ways, I actually thought about this a lot after grocery shop, was, do we need, and once again, AI assist is great, but are the expectations that store associates are more informed these days? Because consumers are coming in more informed. And I'm not talking about just consumer electronics, which is, one that people always refer to, but I think it extends to all of retail. And it's funny, that was actually one of my biggest takeaways from grocery shop, was this idea that, whether it's powered by RMNs, but this idea that consumers expect store associates to have more knowledge than they have in the past.
I think that's accurate. And I think you just touched on one of the more underrated, aspects of retail and restaurants is, having that knowledgeable salesperson. And, a lot of management teams, being a retail analyst for some time, always preach the idea of we want to, have our customers be our associates. And I think that there definitely is correlation with the most successful chains are the ones that have the most knowledgeable salespeople. Now, obviously, that's difficult. That's easier said than done in a period where labor availability is tough. But I do think that if you are able to bring in that expert, I think that improves the overall experience. And generally speaking, you do see that trend. And I think that's going to end up being that could play into this idea, could be derivative of the retail media aspect of it all. To your point, I think consumers are coming in much better educated. A lot of that because of some of the retail media, some of the other things out there. But I think that could be an interesting trend to watch. But your first point too, about the power of offline visits here too. It's been super interesting to look at, and to crib something from Andrew Lipson from eMarketer did a great presentation at Grocery Talk about Grocery Shock about retail media, and kind of we've moved past kind of retail media 1.0, which is kind of the more digital side of that. Retailers using their apps and their digital assets to be kind of the retail media, and moved into that physical side. There's going to be extensions from that, and I think people underestimate. I mean, there's been so much talk about digital commerce the last decade. Really 2 decades. But at the end of the day, that's still, predominantly an offline visit. Still for most chains, offline outweighs online. And so it's a good way to balance. I mean, I think there's ways to participate in both, and kind of the omni-channel retail media, kind of you have to participate in all channels with that as well, and kind of make it integrated. And I think, again, we're just very early on with that. And it'll be interesting, the ripple effects we see from that, because I think just, more knowledgeable store associates is just one of many ways we're going to see retail change because of retail media.
Well, it was interesting. We met with several, well, more than several tech companies, and some are POS providers. But this idea around screens and cameras and the ability to measure, right, consumer behavior, right, in a way that we haven't thought about before, that I thought was really interesting. And this idea, there's been concerns, right, if you're a smaller retailer, that you're not able to kind of get your share of the RMN pie.
Yeah.
So I think there are different ways that they're thinking about measurement and whatnot. So that I think is really interesting. What do you make on the, it's interesting that kind of both Depot and Lowe's, right, you're seeing kind of from these online unique visits. How do you think about kind of home improvement versus these other categories?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it comes back to the idea that, with home improvement, it's a specialized category, and typically you need to do research on that before you go in the store. I know when something breaks at my house, I usually have to research it before going into the store. So I think that's where a lot of those online visits take place, as opposed to it, dominating the in-store. I think that's one of those categories that certainly you come in better prepared. And again, that's the one that a perfect example of that specialized associate there as well. So that's what I make of that. Is typically a lot of those online search is just kind of doing some homework on different products and different solutions before going into the store and making the purchase. So I think that's one of those things that really validates that point you were making.
Right. And let's move ahead to the next, which I think we did touch on holiday, but I think you guys have some really interesting data here in terms of thinking about some of the kind of it goes back to, right, like the change in the holiday season.
Yeah.
And I think, this idea that, Black Friday, for many reasons, right, I think it's like the whole week now is kind of that celebration of kind of going into the final sprint. So maybe just kind of walk through kind of what you would have expected last year and what you're kind of, I mean, we're just a few weeks away
Yeah, exactly.
From having some of this data. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to look at, because I think this idea that you're not making up the holiday season, it's getting earlier and earlier. I think most consumers kind of see that already play out, and it's interesting because if we look kind of back to last year on a year over pre versus post pandemic basis, we were actually up most of October. Some of that was pulled forward. We saw some different sale events during that period. Some of that Halloween has become a bigger part of the overall holiday calendar. So it's not you're not crazy. It is getting earlier and earlier, and I think it's going to get even earlier this year. We've already started to see it. The year over year-over-year numbers here, that was largely just some of the headwinds that we saw, but we did see a lot of things cool down in November. So I think it almost is the case where it got pulled forward too much and then there wasn't enough product, there wasn't enough excitement in November until right around I guess we had the big 21 in terms of that was still kind of the reopening year and a lot of people wanted to shop. So that's why you see those big trends down year over year. That was kind of the first period a lot of people post-pandemic had a chance to shop, but really the rest of November you didn't see a lot, and then you didn't see a lot of excitement right to the holiday period. So I think we can kind of see this pull forward earlier, kind of spread out the holiday season, which is going to benefit October. November, again, I mentioned was weak, so we're going to probably see a little bit of benefit there as well. But again, kind of the softness again, kind of spreading out, and then right before the holiday, that last minute shopper picking up there too. So I think this idea of the spread out holiday season is here to stay, and we'll see how much earlier it gets pulled forward. I don't know how much more into the summer we can handle here, but that's interesting to see.
And I think on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about different banners in different markets. And as somebody who survived the Federated May kind of M&A, this is a topic I've spoken about for like a decade. So love to kind of hear how you think about this and how it differs by whether it's psychographic, demographic, but this is one that I feel like we'll be debating at time.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and I guess that shows you both how old or how long we've been doing this. If we both remember those days, it's interesting too, because I think that right now it's been fascinating to watch the within a different group. I mean, we see it now, not just Del Hayes here with the different banners they have. We see it across the board with any multi-brand retailer or restaurant chain, whether it be Darden, whether it be an Albertsons, whether it be somebody else. We're really kind of seeing different demographics, different psychographics emerge as different reasons for these. And, I think that just comes with the territory too. But I think kind of multi-banner gives you a lot of different options to work with. You can have a banner that's more targeted to millennial and Gen Z households. You can have something that's a little bit more, kind of middle income, or even older groups as well. So it's kind of interesting. We can see the different things play out. It's interesting too, because all the things we've talked about are intertwined here too. We're seeing, as migration patterns happen and people move into more suburban areas. That's given a lot of the grocers different reasons to go after these with different formats. In some cases, maybe we see a big rural push in certain states. We want to open up actually a larger box that's more experiential. H-E-B and Hy-Vee have definitely seen success with some of these large format stores. But maybe in a case like Meijer, we've seen some of that higher household income, move away from the urban centers and go into suburban markets, but there's not availability for kind of our 50,000 foot box in this particular neighborhood. Maybe we have to get by with a 35 or even a 25,000 square foot box and put something in there that has a little bit more experiential, that targets these higher household income consumers that moved away from urban settings and now are suburban residents. So I think it's interesting. Just I think if nothing else, it almost is case by case. We've seen so much change market by market in terms of the makeup. Those the site selection plans that you had in place pre-pandemic, and the reasons why we go into a certain market. A lot of cases, those have changed completely. It may be a completely different trade area that you're working with. The characteristics of the persona in those markets completely change. So I think that that's the message right now. If we look across the board, is that it's nice to be able to have different banners that can appeal to different customer groups, but you have to be mindful in every market. There's going to be situation by situation, and a lot of these trade areas have completely changed, and really have to understand as you make your site selection, as you make your real estate format plans, you really have to understand all the differences in a market by market basis.
And RJ, we have a bunch of questions for you, so I'm not sure if we'll be able to get through all the slides actually, but let me at least get some of these questions thrown your way.
Sure.
So can RJ elaborate on why national chains are now entering smaller markets less than 100,000 to as small as 50,000? And are you talking about trade areas like 50,000 a trade area or 50,000 in a market?
In some cases, actually market. And so the rationale behind that is that a lot of these markets, it's more sub 100,000. It's really kind of the sweet spot, 150 to 100,000 is where we've seen it. And again, this is more trade area than it is market. But what's been interesting is to see that a lot of chains have seen that those populations have grown. So maybe it was a case where it was 100, now 150,000. So obviously quite a bit of expansion, 33% growth in that market, or 50% growth in that market. So pretty impressive growth in a lot of cases that, see population growth. A lot of times it's higher household income. But I think the biggest motivation is that the economics work. I mean, it's in most cases, it's cheaper to build out the locations in these smaller markets. In a lot of cases, it's you get access to labor. The labor and national brand comes into these markets. All the the employable population wants to work at that particular store. Rent costs are generally cheaper. Build out costs are generally cheaper. Chipotle has been the best example we've done, because they've talked a lot about this. The idea that I think it was last year, the fourth quarter call, they talked about being able to go from their ultimate store based target was 6,000 units. Now it's 7,000 units. And a lot of that was because of the success they're seeing in smaller markets. And we tested our data, and lo and behold, in smaller markets, they generally see a 15 to 20% increase or higher visits per location than some of the larger markets. So seeing higher visits per location, then when you factor in the lower costs involved, that's why we're seeing this downstream movement. Is just kind of you're meeting your consumers where you are, but it's also cheaper to operate. Sometimes they may operate with different formats. Maybe it's a smaller box. We've certainly seen that with cases like Lowe's and Petco and Kohl's in some cases as well. But I think that's what's driving a lot of motivation. It's meeting your consumers where you are, but it's also less costly to operate.
All right. There's a lot here. Anything you can address specifically about the housing market and its impact on home furnishings retailing?
Yeah, it's interesting because housing obviously is, housing turnover and interest rates are some of the key factors you typically look at in terms of home furnishing sales. Those are usually pretty good predictors of what you'll typically see on that. What has been interesting on that front is, we did obviously, home values spike and stuff like that. And I think that's actually been interesting. Home values spike and a lot of interest rate spike has actually kind of kept a lot of consumers, they're kind of stuck in their homes, if you will, for lack of a better term at this point. And they probably bought all the home furnishing, products, during the pandemic. There was a lot of pull forward in demand. Now, because we're not seeing as much turnover, housing prices have generally held up pretty well in most markets, although there are some that we're starting to see a fall off. But basically, I think we're at a point where there's not a lot of housing turnover. There's people kind of stuck in their home because of interest rates. Because of that's put a lot of downward demand on particularly the larger, furniture type products. Like, as I mentioned, housewares have actually seen a decent recovery, but that's largely been event driven. And typically that small product, there's also obviously that halo effect with Bed Bath & Beyond on that one as well. But I think it's interesting to kind of look at the overall housing market. The interesting too is if you look at kind of home furnishing versus home improvement, historically, if you look back the last 25, 30 years of data, typically those track pretty closely to one another. We're seeing a little bit of a decoupling now because the way people use their house assets. This goes back to your question, Deborah, on the, improving these kind of assets within your life. Obviously, people are spending more time at their home, and just maybe you don't need a new, couch or anything like that, but you see a lot more just kind of wear and tear with that. And I think that's led to, obviously home improvement trends on a year-over-year basis are down. Home Depot and Lowe's both said the same thing. A lot of that's price sensitivity, but I think ultimately home improvement is one of those categories where if we go back and look at structural versus pull forward demand, we have seen some evidence of structural changes around the home improvement category. And while we're dealing with some tough year-over-year compares and some price sensitivity, that's when we are starting to see a lot more visits from kind of that younger consumer. We're starting to see a lot of smaller pro projects drive demand there as well. So if I had to sum up the home improvement and the home category as general, I think home furnishings is kind of stuck in a tougher environment right now, but home improvement, generally speaking, with all the wear and tear in your house, could be in a better situation after we kind of get through these tough compares right now.
I'm going to ask RJ one more question that you guys submitted. We're probably about 10 questions that we didn't get to. So one, we did have a question, will the slides be available afterwards? We will get those to everyone. And we'll also get, we'll have like a Q&A with some of these questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. And if you have questions afterwards, please submit. Once again, it was, there's so much to talk about here, and even an hour, we can't. We
could have made this another couple of hours easily. Yeah.
Really chipped away. So I'm going to ask you the last one, which is a question that is near and dear to my heart. How will AI affect traditional search patterns in holiday season search?
Yeah, that's another great question. Whoever asked that was fantastic.
Michael, thank you, Michael.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do think we need to start thinking about it. I mean, if you think about AI, not just generative AI, but just AI across the board, I mean, it's influencing every function within a retailer right now. I mean, a lot of us think about it as kind of more the marketing focus in the search terms, but really it's having an impact already on just day-to-day operations in almost every aspect of the retail function. I think it could start to, I mean, obviously search being a big part of the, what kind of gets people to the right products and stuff like that. I think as you start to see AI integrated into some of the different, search groups and stuff like that, it could have a big impact on, what drives and what products are there as well. So it's interesting to see. I mean, I guess kind of, let's put it this way. My answer is I actually don't know how it's going to impact, but I know it will have an impact. I think it is kind of the answer right now. And we're going to kind of have to, do a postmortem on different things from a digital and physical side too, because I think it'll have an impact on driving physical store visits as well. We'll have to do a postmortem and look at it. So I think, with as much adoption as we've seen on AI this year, I think in particular generative AI, I think that's going to have a real impact on the overall marketing message and the way search is used to find things this year. So again, I don't know how it's exactly manifests itself, but I think it will have an impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for this season, we're seeing the capabilities right around more kind of predictive search. I think better product recommendations.
Yeah.
It goes back to, it's interesting when we were talking earlier about kind of restaurants versus retail. I do think that in some cases, right, it's easier in a retail environment to kind of offer that better customer service. But I think that I think it's being elevated across. And I think consumers are going to expect, whether they're in a restaurant, anything where they're interacting, right, with, kind of, somebody more on the customer service side, their expectations are elevated. And then I also feel, although I've seen different technology around this, that even if you're in a dressing room, that this idea that your kind of whole experience is elevated, right? With more kind of, whether it's contextual, but better information kind of to make a decision. So this idea that you as a human are kind of, you have better access to information at the time that you need it, and that it's more personalized to you. And I think we're seeing a lot of different technology providers offer that this holiday season. Now, a lot of it is kind of, if you will, single threaded. And I think that's what retailers are kind of trying to figure out right now, right? RJ is like, which, I've got this like tech stack, but I've also got all of this opportunity, like, where do I? And so it was interesting when you talked about regionality, we are hearing a lot of kind of experimentation by region. And so that I think is going to be incredibly interesting. But I do feel that we're just getting started, and it'll be
Right.
interesting to see the impact this holiday season. And then looking ahead to 24, right, where people are spending and where they're focusing in by product category. I think we're going to just see a real change. And I think we're going to have expectations around greater efficiency out of spend as well.
Yeah, I think you hit it. I mean, I think this is a test and learn year for a lot of the retailers with AI, what is capable, what isn't capable, and then I think, to your point, that'll give a lot of the the guideposts for next year in terms of how you plan it and adopt it into your point. I think we're seeing it on a regional merchandising perspective too. I think that's exactly what we've heard from a lot of our retailer partners as well.
It's going to be fascinating. RJ, thank you so much. This was
Thank you.
absolutely phenomenal. We'll get you all the questions that we didn't have a chance to answer. And everyone, thank you for joining us and staying with us. And apologies, we didn't get to all of your questions, but we will get them to you. RJ, thanks again. Can't wait to hear the updates during the holiday season. It's going to be great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.